King of Podcasts proudly presents The Broadcasters Podcast, a weekly media commentary talking about traditional and digital media headlines and talking to the content creators out front and behind the scenes. Here is the King of Podcasts. It's time once again for another Broadcasters Podcast, episode number 138. Thanks for being here. Glad to have you subscribe to the show, how you find it. Listen, I know I have a pretty intimate boutique audience that listens to this show. This is not a show that's made for big mass consumption, even though we talk about mass media here on the program on a regular basis. I understand that, and that's okay. For me, more than anything else, I like the fact of being able to go and bring this audience together, which I believe are like-minded media professionals, those that have been in the space for a long time, those that are looking to get themselves into the space and become adopters, apprentices, whatever it might be. I think there are those that will realize the kind of fight I'm having here to kind of foster creativity, foster the fight against corporate culture, social culture, and PC culture. Because there's just all this right here that comes into play that I'd like to see all of us together find our way out of all of this. Just get ourselves to a better place. I'd like to see that for everyone. And that's what the show's all about. Tonight, we're going to go ahead and delve more into journalism. No interview tonight. Haven't done any interviews as of late. I am looking to go ahead and bring some more onto the board. But at the moment, what I'm going to do in the meantime is I am bringing on just taking some extra time to talk about certain stories that really do matter to me, that are important to the cause, important to what we're trying to do here. That's what matters to me the most, is to get ourselves to a better place so that after the pandemic, realizing the digital disruption and saying to ourselves, okay, what are we going to do to get everybody together when everything's right now breaking apart? You got to understand, as the pandemic is happening, establishment is crumbling in front of us. The existing establishment, when it comes to music, movies, TV, and radio, are all changing. The live concert model. When you look at music, when you look at the movie model, you see the exhibitions and the movie theaters actually being able to play movies. Well, we're finally starting to see that now. And one of the biggest tests coming up right now is Tenet, which is coming out this coming week. And that's what's going to be most important, is how is that going to perform with all the movie theaters not being completely open yet and only being open at a particular capacity. Now, the update for me here in Florida, where I'm at, movie theaters available in most of the state right now at 50% capacity. Where I'm at in Palm Beach County, I'm waiting to hopefully September 8th will be the official date when we will be into a portion of phase 2 where we'll have movie theaters, bowling alleys, and the like opening up. And so by as early as not this weekend, but it'll look like September 11th, not a great day to go to the movies when I think about what was happening 19 years ago. The idea will be that there will be movies available. I'll be able to go to my local movie theater and finally go to a movie theater for the first time in almost 6 months. Almost 6 months of the day. But it'll be nice to get back and do it. And honestly, having to just throw on a mask as I go in and out and in the theater is not a big hindrance to me. I don't mind it so much. Kind of gotten used to it. And that's where we are. So what can I say? Let's move along now. Here's what's going on now. On the show tonight, a few things I want to bring up. We're going to talk about, again, the world of journalism. And as you see tonight's episode, will the digital disruption destroy the old journalism bubble? Because what we need to see more exposed than anything else, that the digital disruption does. Again, we're seeing what it's doing to Hollywood. We talked about that last week and how it has significantly made a major change to what's going on in Hollywood. When you see the sitcoms and how they're being done, will sitcoms be a normal happenstance when you see, networks going forward, or just where you're going to see them only on Netflix because of how the deals are done, because of the money that has to be doled out by the networks to be able to put something like this out? Will Netflix and Hulu and Apple be the ones that are the place to go for sitcoms if you want to watch that programming? Or you go to the other ones to watch older sitcoms, and then the only place for new sitcoms, it's a give and take, because are there any new sitcoms that are good? Well, under the parameters of network and cable TV, if you're not on Netflix and you're able to be a little bit more raunchy, a little more gory in the content, or if you want to just be much more vulgar in the content, you can on Netflix. They can tack on a NC-7 or a mature
rating on there, and then you'll be able to do that. But again, I mean, there are shows that obviously can play like an HBO where they have full creativity on the language. Same thing for Netflix. There's that going on as well. It doesn't make much of a difference when you look at it all together. But as we've talked about here on the program, there's been so much that's been going on that COVID with the digital disruption has really created a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. It's not the best way to say about it, but again, Hollywood is crumbling thanks to COVID, and now journalism is further crumbling. And that's what we're seeing more than anything else. But I wasn't going to use journalism as crumbling thanks to COVID. I didn't want to do it like that. But I think the common story is happening more than ever. And so we have that to talk about. A number of different stories when it comes to journalism and where it's going, and where I think there's just a lot of different routes that are going on when it comes to journalism. The trust, the integrity, and the direction of where you find journalism that everybody can agree with, that everybody can absorb and be informed and not feel like they're being biased, because I think bias has really, truly killed journalism. And this is on both sides of the aisle. This is a left or right wing argument, doesn't matter. Objectivity is the object. That is the key of this. Remember, it goes into the word, just in the anatomy of the word. Object. You're talking about the object. The object is who, what, when, where, and why. It's that simple. It really is not a rocket scientist to be a journalist. Good writing skills, good communication skills, good interviewing skills, and good research skills. Really, if you have those four things, you become a good journalist. But then the things you have to have with any career as you go into, and I think everybody can tell this, you first have to have a thick skin. And second, you have to be able to push back and do what you need to do to keep pushing forward. It's going to be tough in a corporate environment. It's going to be tough in a PC environment. It's going to be tough in a social environment. But for those that are able to persevere and able to move forward, those are the ones that will do well. And that's what we need to see happen. But again, when the establishment that is run a certain way on a certain budget without having any kind of a surplus for a rainy day, well, the rainy day is here. And a lot of companies were not ready for this. So everybody had to handle it as such. The one thing that's happened is not everybody's getting bailed out. So unlike how things might have happened, when the banks were getting bailed out or the car companies being bailed out, people thought this might have happened again for all these corporations, that they wouldn't get bailed out. Well, they got loans, which they're going to have to eventually pay back. But they were given the opportunity with the Paycheck Protection Program, as far as I know it, that a lot of businesses, because of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve offered money to a lot of companies that took it in order for them to find their way back. But of course, they were going to still deal with a financial struggle to make their way back. And that's what happens. But again, the money that needs to be made for these operations to run smoothly, they were already struggling with that anyway and running on debt. And now here we are again. And then there are some organizations that they're so big that they have other portions of their organization that are very profitable, and then those are able to go ahead and carry the load for the news operations that are not making money. That's what it comes down to. News is still made very important, but again, it's just a cog in the wheel of a machine that is corporate. That's what it is. So now, a couple of studies that I want to bring up that help support my claim tonight. And of course, I try to find outlets that are neutral. Because again, I'm trying to be apolitical here. And I am trying to find neutral outlets that will give me information that I can talk about here on the program. Because I think it's very important. So now what I'm going to go through first is Nieman Lab. NiemanLab.org, which I've gone through several times to talk about stories. So, recent story, it says that Americans are skeptical of the press, and most think that's a good thing. Okay. So they go in the story. It's a Pew Research analysis based on interviews with 10,300 adults between February and March 2020. This is before the pandemic, but again, this still is a good sampling of what's really going on. Some of the takeaways we have is, number one, representation in news coverage really matters to black Americans. Nearly 7 out of every 10 black adults, or 68%, said it's important for news outlets to cover people like me in stories. 41% of white adults, 54% of Hispanic adults said the same thing. Now let's move along here. Americans are largely skeptical of the news media, and most agree that's a good thing. The amount of the sampling is very telling. A little less than half of U.S. adults say they have a fair amount of, or a great deal of confidence that journalists act in the best interests of the public. 48%. That's not a good number. You would expect it to be significantly higher. But I'm sure when they've done this poll, it was higher in the past. And you know what has caused a skepticism? Is technology. Social media, the advent of the internet, all changed it. Because I'm sure if you put this poll back out, this survey back in the 90s or in the 80s, you would get a different story. Because you had a limited amount of outlets. You had your local newspaper, you had your local TV news, and you had several networks to watch. And maybe CNN. And that's it. That's all you had. And all you were getting was news. Because it wasn't so much time being devoted to news like it is now. Now we have 24-hour news channels. And we have a plethora of news sites all competing for the same audience. When there's so much news to cover, it's funny how so many different sites cover the same thing. And I've been learning that, especially when it comes to politics, and this is going on both of y'all. Again, I'm staying apolitical here. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. A lot of lowest common denominator information. When we really want investigative journalism, when we really want stories to come out with information, where we don't have to dig deep into a story to find out something that's important. Again, just the facts. But again, there's the thought about truth over facts, and facts, are being created. They're being manufactured. And this is going on both sides of the aisle. When I look at, just even on the news aggregators that I have now, and I look and I try to see there's the bias on one side or the other, but there's just so much going on. Now, in the same study, nearly 1 in 5 U.S. adults report they have no skepticism at all. Okay. In the meantime, skepticism of the media is good, and they see room for confidence to rise. 63% of adults say that ideally it's better if the public is skeptical rather than trusting in the news media. 75% say it is possible to improve the level of confidence Americans have in the news media. So we never needed to necessarily have so much skepticism, but it's increasing. The numbers are reverse of what they should be. You would hope that journalists would have a moral code. They would have a journalistic code, a shield, an oath to the profession. Journalists should have a Hippocratic oath, Hippocratic style oath. At least they used to have that, a shield to protect yourselves, because a journalist is supposed to have some kind of a morals, some kind of at least something that really attains to that they're going to have ethics with what they're doing, that they're not trying to report a story to hurt or dismember or to destroy somebody's life. I mean, it shouldn't be that way. The story should tell itself. The people that are the actual eyewitnesses, when you actually get a microphone or a recorder in front of somebody and they can go on the record and they give their name and you get several sources to do the same thing, it's the people that will tell the story, because those journalists that are out there, you're in a bubble. We talked about that. You don't have the wherewithal to know everything that's going on in your life. If you're a food critic, sure. If you're a movie critic, sure, because you watch and you consume a lot of content, or you consume a lot of food, and you go to a lot of restaurants, and you go out. But again, when we're talking about journalists, you're set with a particular set of skills. You apply those skills, but we don't want you to go beyond those skills unless you are writing an opinion or editorial. That is different. But again, we're talking about journalists. Journalists should not honestly be in the role of being a columnist. Okay? There is a difference. And we have a lot of people that want to be the columnist because they want to have their take. Well, that's fine. But the thing is, then you can't be a journalist. You can be a columnist. And that's okay. You can inject news into being a columnist or a opinion editorial writer. Absolutely. But you have to label yourself as such. This is where the skepticism comes in. If you do this, it will make things easier. It would just really, it's just to clarify the lines. This is why I like the bias meters right now that are going on with news aggregators like ground.news or allnews.com or all sides. I love those. Give me the bias. Show me that, because you know what? If these journalists will not do the due diligence of telling us what their label is, where they feel in any particular subject, or what the feelings or the views or the slant of a particular publication is, then allow me to get it from an aggregator who will do the judging for me. But see, now we have to have arbiters. The real arbiters of truth are the aggregators. They're the ones that are really telling us if there's a bias. They are grading and auditing all these stories to get the right thing out. That's what they're doing. And it's being done through an algorithm. It's not even that hard. It's so simple for them to go and find out. Okay, this publication, this writer, pretty simple. You can read their track record. You can read how they write. They can probably check the algorithm and they can be able to read the actual content, the actual text, word for word, and find out if there's a bias or not. There should not be. It should be center-ridden. If you want, and the thing is, I don't want fairness doctrine either. I don't want to have biases where the left is allowed to talk, then the right needs to talk. No, I don't want that either. You know, people should be able to find their outlets and find places to go. Because let's be honest here. We see that with journalism, you know, when it comes to radio, you have ways to get to your content, right? I mean, look, if you want a left-wing radio, you go to NPR. And they have a lot of FM stations around the country to go ahead and cover that. If you want right-wing, well, there's a lot of conservative talk shows, right? So you can go ahead and find all those on any AM station that you want, right? But when you talk about national news media, cable news media, a national audience that they cover, there should be no bias, right? There shouldn't be. There's room for bias. Yes, there's always been. And the capital market has always determined what is such. So if Premier Radio Networks decides to go ahead and run exclusively conservative content because their content is run on conservative radio stations, well, there was a time where Air America was the counterpart. They ran left-wing content. For whatever reason, that network, regardless of how they were programmed and how they were managed, the audience did not take on. And the reason why is because NPR, whether you like it or not, has served as the left-wing outlet. So a mainstream left-wing outlet did not work, because the left-wing outlet, obviously, anything that's a left-wing or left-slanted content, it has to be delivered a certain way. That's what NPR does. Because it fits, because of the people that are being positioned to report over there. And they also have their people where they're just, you know, they have who they bring on in the markets that they are in major metropolitan cities. Whether it's San Francisco or New York or Chicago or Pittsburgh or Boston, it doesn't matter. But they might have a slant, and that's okay, but at least you know what it is. I mean, you can already know that the entire audience will see that as such. Now, it's funny that NPR or PBS is actually considered center, but it is left-wing. And that's okay. But at least you have room for the bias. I mean, it should be better identified. That's the point. But we're not going to see that anyway. And that's okay. If they choose not to do that, you know, it's behooving upon them to go ahead and at least remove this skepticism that I'm talking about in this article, because there's a skepticism. You know why? Because there are no clear delineated lines that identify what you are watching. Everything should have discretion. You know, there should be a thing where when you're watching the news, you know, it would be nice to go ahead and show a way to go ahead and let somebody know, okay, this is an opinion editorial. We don't need you to go and tell what your bias is. We'll find out what your bias is, but what you need to do is call yourself a columnist. And, you know, people have a chance to read or listen or watch your content, and they will figure out where you land on things, and they will decide if they want to continue listening to you or not. That's just the free market. Same thing goes for television. Same thing goes for, you know, whatever. I mean, music shouldn't really necessarily have that, but there's a bias towards music, I would imagine. Some people, the artists themselves might have it, or the celebrities in Hollywood might have one. But again, to inject that as part of what you're doing, you know, news should be news, and bias should be in news. To have that incorporated into education, to have that incorporated into Hollywood, to have it incorporated into the national media, the elite establishment media, there's where we are. But then what's even worse of that, and I'm going to get back into the story of the Neiman Lab, is most Americans think their news is influenced by corporate interests. This is another thing. When you have corporate organizations, of which all the major news organizations are owned by 4 networks, 4 major companies. When you see that, then that's a problem. Because what does that corporate outlet have? Again, the corporate system will narrate the direction of a network. And so if they're all in a bubble, and you might have some people that are former news executives that found their way up, or you have people that are running companies that just have a particular slant, and then they direct the staff, management, and talent and people behind the scenes to go a certain route with their news, then they're following what their publishers, their editors-in-chief, their news directors are saying. And that's what you have to deal with. A full 80% of Americans think the news they receive is influenced somewhat or a great deal by financial and corporate interests. So the point is, it's money related. So corporate is going to go ahead and find ways to make money. But then what they've learned is they don't make money like they used to by just reporting the facts, right? Let me explain like this. So not too long ago, 80s into the 90s, you had a lot of news magazine shows, right? Dateline NBC, 48 Hours, Primetime Live. Every network had a show like this. They all had news magazines. Well, the news magazines are by the wayside. And they're taken away from cable because we're not watching news magazines where you used to see additional stories that were going on, and you would get a longer passage on a story that was going on that would be of interest. You know, those kind of things were going on. But today it's about the here and now of news because news moves so fast. And to take stories that take a while to tell, you know, the arbiters here, the people that are running these news organizations, the elite media establishment, they don't want to take time to do that because they think we're going to just work on this news cycle and we're going to go ahead and put out stories that will be, in particular to us, to keep people glued to the TV set like a drug. So we see what they do with politics. It's like a drug. COVID is like a drug. And what they're doing is they are injecting several different forms of emotions to create a stir on those that are watching. And they believe this is a way to keep them influenced, right? And the corporate interests, they don't give a shit. They're basically like, listen, you need to keep people watching our programming. You need to keep people reading the links to our stories, which is where we get rage bait, clickbait, all of that. And then you see the same thing being identified on camera if you're watching a story on any network newscast or any cable newscast. They are doing what is called yellow journalism. This is a thing that goes back to the days of William Randolph Hearst. Okay? Journalism that is based upon sensationalism and crude exaggeration. This has been going on back to the 1890s. There's a story going back to 2016 from JSTOR.org. Now, in this particular story, they talked about to fix fake news, look to yellow journalism. And the particular newspaper that was particularly mentioned is the New York Journal that was owned by William Randolph Hearst. So now a mix of cynical political operators and political business opportunists have blanketed the internet and social networks in particular with wholly manufactured news stories and publications. It's hard to argue with the narrative, which has now been backed up with interviews by fake news producers with data on the spread of fake news stories. And even this story is being very clickbaitish. Let's just be honest. Yet we are unlikely to prevail in this battle if we treat the problem of fake news as a creature of the internet. Or, for that matter, as a problem unto itself. Fake news is part of a larger problem of click journalism. Media that focuses on getting online click-throughs or on clicking with our preconceived bias. Now, there are many precedents in the history of mass media. The history of this includes a period of journalism so reputable it was coined the term yellow journalism. And here's what it is. So the yellow journalism of the 1890s and tabloid journalism in the 1920s and 30s stigmatized the press as a profit-motivated purveyor of cheap thrills and vicarious experiences. Sounds a lot like today. To its many critics, it seemed as though the press was using the freedom from regulation it enjoyed from the First Amendment to make money instead of using it to fulfill its vital role as an independent source of information. The Commission on Freedom of the Press issued a report in 1947 called the Free and Responsible Press, which urged the press to be socially responsible. So this has been a problem that's been over 130 years. Thomas Arthur Gullison enumerates the features of yellow journalism as a dependence on the familiar aspects of sensationalism, crime news, scandal and gossip, divorces and sex, and stress upon the reporting of disasters and sports. The lavish use of pictures, many of them without significance, inviting the abuses. By the way, lavish use of pictures, many of them without significance. So again, crafty editing. You know, you're talking about projection. We're talking about areas where news is then preconceived to fit a narrative, and it is warped. We see it. Then you also have the abuses of picture stealing and faked pictures, and imposters and frauds of various kinds, and faked interviews and stories. In her 1910 critique of the newspaper industry, Frances Fenton quoted President Theodore Roosevelt's own accusation that contemporary newspapers, quote, habitually and continually, and as a matter of business practice, every form of mendacity known to man, from the suppression of truth and the suggestion of the false to the lie direct. Victor Yaros referred to critics of yellow journalism, where he said that critics of yellow journalism saw sensationalism and dishonesty as a business strategy. Victor Yaros wrote this in 1922. Some writers have not hesitated to indict the entire newspaper business or profession on such charges as deliberate suppression of certain kinds of news, distortion of news actually published, studied unfairness towards certain classes, political organizations and social movements, systematic catering to powerful groups of advertisers, brazen and vicious faking and reckless disregard of decency, proportion and taste for the sake of increased profits. I leave it there. Now we can talk about the Spanish-American War, which is one of the major stories to talk about this. But again, shock and awe, outrage and fear. And you see the stories we deal with today, the election, the presidential election coming up, the coronavirus pandemic, okay? All this, and then you see all the civil unrest, I call it, in major cities around the country as a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, and all I'm going to say is about that. The movement that is protesting, and we do see rioting and looting. If you look online, you can find videos of rioting and looting. There just is. But again, it's for the sake of trying to reverse systemic racism or institutional racism, right? Institutional injustices, as they say it is. So the thing is, I'm not here to say one way or the other. But again, we're talking about the journalism itself. That's where we are. So yellow journalism is back. It's been back. It's been back for, I want to say, in the last 20 years. Again, the internet really brought this back on. It was another opportunity to do that. And the reason why, okay, is because of the fact that it's a response by the corporate types that they kept things the way they are. And since they're not forward thinking, many of them, we see some companies that are not forward thinking, they're not creative, and they're not thinking ahead to try to revolutionize or innovate what they're doing in order to keep up. Thus, the internet took away everything. The music industry has been obliterated. It's nothing like it was before. The same thing goes for movies. The same thing goes for TV. Same thing goes for radio. Thus, the Broadcasters Podcast. Why I like to talk about all this. Because without the digital disruption and what it did, what would I talk about? But there's so much to be said. There's so much to document here. And journalism is a great place to also go with it. Again, we just look at different aspects and we talk about it. And that's what goes on here. It's amazing to see what all has happened. and why we are at a point where there's just so much to be fixed that cannot be fixed right away with all that's happened. It's unfortunate, but it's just where we are. So I'm going to go away from that story that I just used right there from 2016. I'm going to go ahead and move along into current day, a current article from Editor and Publisher, because they are referring to the digital age of yellow journalism. That's where we are now. Objective local news sites are critical to the Fourth Estate. So Mike Shapiro writes, this is from a couple weeks ago, by the way, while they can always do better, by and large, the national media continues to effectively serve as a check on the government on a national level. National news outlets feature significant and oftentimes probing coverage of the presidency and the current presidential campaign. The national umpires of the Fourth Estate appear to be keeping their eyes on the game, at least for now. But there's a critical piece missing. The bright lights of national coverage are obscuring an insidious trend at the local level, declining objective local coverage. Now, this writer says he feels like that they are doing a good job, somewhat serving as a check on the government. I'm going to beg to differ, because Washington, D.C. is a very corrupt town. And I mean, they don't have the power to go ahead and do anything, even if they try to expose people. Let's just be honest here. When we see the reporting that's been going on by the news media, regardless of how you feel about who's in Congress, who's in the White House, let's be honest here. Of all the news stories we've had right now in journalism in the last couple of years, during this certain presidency, because of all the news reporting that we have, you would think that all the stories that were broken as a result, regardless if they were true or not, regardless of if you need to go ahead and be skeptical of what the stories are, you would think that certain stories would create action, would create change. So let me give you a couple examples. All right, look at the Harvey Weinstein saga, Me Too movement. A lot of things happened where change became possible. But did it affect real change or not? Well, the only person that really got discovered out of all this was Harvey Weinstein, who I believe was made as a scapegoat to placate everybody else in Hollywood because he needed to let a big fish get let go and be succumbed to the outrage that was created by the journalists, by the media. But again, there were a lot of other people that probably could have been caught up in the Me Too movement, and they might have been reported on, but did they ever get convicted? No. Was anybody besides Harvey Weinstein punished? No. When you look at what's gone on in the media in Washington, D.C., is there anyone that's been reported upon that has been arrested or jailed or has been indicted? Has there? I mean, really, and after being indicted, being arrested, being jailed, and being punished if they did wrong. Have we seen anybody get that? No. So how effective is the media right now? That's the point. They don't need to be a check. They need to be an audit. Okay, they need to do more, but they're not. So they say they do significant and oftentimes probing coverage. Sure, they're doing a lot of coverage, but is it doing any good? Because you got to look at it like a court case. Are they bringing enough evidence that can be held in a court of law? Actual testimony that will be credible and would not be circumstantial, right? You could actually have witnesses take the stand and actually report directly to what's going on with the story in order to convict or to take a company down or whatever it might be. Ask yourself that. Because objective journalism should be so credible and such good bulletproof evidence in a court of law. But does any of the news that we see right now, any elite media establishment stuff right now, does any of it hold in a court of law? No. So I'm going to say Mike Shapiro is mistaken. He's wrong. Because you can say it's a check, but nothing's being effectively done. Nothing's happening here. There is nothing that causes any kind of effect. Okay? When Watergate happened, right? In 1974, we've heard the story of All the President's Men. We've heard of Woodward and Bernstein. Well, people did go down for that, right? We had hearings and we had arrests and we had indictments and we had people taken down. Yes. But what else have we had? Let's be honest here. What else have we had? There was a time where tabloids were left on the grocery store checkout line. Well, we're not there anymore. Honestly, look at an episode of Inside Edition any time now. You can find it any local channels on local access right now. The way the reports are done on network and cable news, even the reporting, the style of reporting is exactly the same. But Inside Edition's been around since the 80s. And they do tabloid journalism. But what they do, they actually report stories that create results. Because they will do the contact, the investigative stories. And when they find somebody doing a scam, they confront them and they catch them in the act. And they get arrested and they get indicted and they get charged. And they get punished. So their reporting actually does something. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yellow journalism doesn't do this. Okay? And this is what happens here. This is, the yellow newspaper was named after the color of the yellow newspaper of William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. But really, yellow means you're not affecting change. We need something to get into the green. Think of a traffic light. You want it to go green. You want where there's a green light made, hypothetically, in a courtroom or in a police station or by some governing body. Okay? You want the stories to be able to stick as like evidence, bulletproof evidence. But we're getting a lot of circumstantial evidence where it would not hold up in a court of law. And that's the best way to kind of judge whether a story is worth it or not. I mean, what also doesn't happen is, there's not enough out there where you're trying to get stories out there and then you're saying, okay, there's not enough being done in the story to confront. And it can't be just because of the resources or anything else. So if national news is the watchtower, according to this story once again, local news serves as the foundation of the fourth estate. But here's the thing. Remember, I think of a couple different channels I watch down here in South Florida. We have Contact 5. WPTV was one of my local stations here, Channel 5. When there's any particular stories, whether it's, dirty dining, and you have a restaurant that has roaches, or they have maggots, or they have all these different food violations, food inspectors come in, they shut down the restaurant, and the restaurant has to change, or the restaurant gets shut down, period. So action is taken, and it's a community effort. And they have the proof. So here's the thing, too. Okay, here's what I want to get back to my original point. So because of the fact that these stories, are being covered in a yellow format where there's nothing really happening, it's all circumstantial. You might have some people that will go ahead and attack the news media with a lawsuit for libel or slander. But again, the problem with libel or slander is that you're going against corporations. So if any of these alphabet lettered outlets were to get a lawsuit, you have to have something that's really solid proof in order to go ahead and make that lawsuit stick, in order to get something back. And again, you're not going to get a punishment by some of these corporate outlets. What you're most likely going to get is a settlement with an NDA. Okay? That's what's going to happen. So we're not getting actually any cases where we're getting actual punishment, where people are being held accountable. So holding people accountable is a phrase that is overused and is not used properly in the media in general. Because holding people accountable does not mean, oh, you just caught them in the act of something. No. Something needs to happen as a result. There has to be an end result to this. There has to be some kind of an action that is caused by this. If you're doing good journalism, doing good investigative reporting, that's what happens. That's how it works. A good lawyer takes a lot of what a good journalist does. They investigate. They learn the story. They find out what's going on. And then they are able to go ahead and present the case to win it. To make sure somebody gets held accountable and really gets held accountable. That's how it works. Now, into the story, let me go ahead and go into something else I want to go and bring up now. And this is from here's the thing. I got two different routes of how people feel about journalists, professionals. I'm going to take one from a publication called The Appalachian Online. This is from someone named Caleb Garbuya, who's an editorial editor at this particular publication. He writes, journalists aren't neutral. Now, he writes that, I learned how to become an objective journalist in the intro to journalism, yet I've always questioned how objectivity exists when media outlets offer different accounts despite reporting the same events. It's no secret that the Wall Street Journal is different than the New York Times and The Economist. These outlets interview different people, different experts, offering their different audience different truths. So say a publication, as a devil's advocate he does here, presents news from a left-right perspective. The publication's objectivity is not compromised because they still present facts. Being impartial means telling opposing truths, equating to longer pieces. Intuition suggests the press must capture viewers from other entertainment industries. Media assumes readers will not spend time reading longer articles. Therefore, journalists shorten stories to captivate readers and filter which truths to tell. There you go. Pew Research did do a study where they stated that readers spend twice as long on longer articles, implying no inverse relationship between length and engagement. Thus, we reject journalists who are constrained by space hypothesis. And that's what goes on. We used to have news magazines that would tell a whole story in an hour. And then we'd learn the story. And then we would find results as a result of this. But we don't get that now. Not at all. So maybe the problem is not with readers, he says, but with journalists themselves. Journalists have the power to tell a story in the order of importance, so is structural bias. You heard that right. Journalists pick what readers look at, supplying them with information. Post-structuralist philosopher Michael Foucault, breaks this relationship down as what is an author. The journalist controls the reader because the journalist possesses information the reader wants. The reader trusts the journalist to provide accurate information about events. Thus, the media controls the consumer, giving the reader what the reader believes is true. Current events lose value during the process. The story is not real because it depicts a snapshot. Reporters decide who to interview, choosing key witnesses for their impressions, since talking to everyone is impossible. This depreciates the story's value because journalists cannot capture the fullness of event. As live footage circulates, the web readers are empowered with truth. So sure, you might have journalists that are on the gun to make sure they get the story in front and right because the news cycle is very short. Okay, I can understand that. But again, there's always other stories you can get that will actually get attention. You know, you should be able to go ahead and report. And this is why you don't need to be worrying about trying to get the whole story. Get what's out there. Just tell the story. Don't try to create what your story is, because here's the point. Do not paint your own self-portrait of events. You don't need to be doing that. You don't need to be creating the story to make people read it. You just tell the story. You get the information, you put it out there first, and then you go back, and then you find more information, and then you add updates. That's what local news does. You know, one of the things I read on the fall, when I used to go in and work in local TV news, one of the things I could tell you more than was always put on a producer's rundown was follow-up, update, follow-up, update, follow-up. So a story got reported first, but we don't have the whole story. So we learn the whole story day by day. And you continue to do that. And that's what's supposed to happen here. But then we get certain stories that have to be told in one shot, and they feel like we got to keep people shocked and awed, and not the whole story is being told. Because people are not going in and learning the whole story. Like with COVID, it's the same thing. You know, what kind of results do we get from the elite media establishment from COVID? Do we get any? What they did was they focused on the worst of the pandemic to keep people locked up in their homes scared. Whether you believe it or not, they did. Now, it doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. That's just what they did. Because if they found a way as a corporate outlet, they said, well, listen, you need to find a way to keep people watching. So we saw how people reacted to 9/11. And people stayed for 3 full days watching full wall-to-wall coverage. Well, the pandemic should feel the same way, but this is a longer event. So we need to do something to make sure that we keep everybody scared shitless, because they're doing that right now. There's no doubt about it. Now, there's more to this, but I'm going to leave it right there. So now, journalists and editors do use tools to prevent biased coverage. They're supposed to be doing that, including fact-checking, interviewing different sources, and using original sources. However, modern bias research tells us that these precautions are not enough. For example, motivated reasoning is a psychological error, letting people think that they let evidence speak when their bias selects the evidence. Confirmation bias, accepting information you agree with and rejecting contrary evidence, is also present. These errors occur in other subjects like statistics. Bad data means bad results. However, statisticians never claim objectivity and leave error margins. Yet people pretend that statistics are more than what they are. They're not a truth bank. Stats are a hypothesis testing tool constrained within empirical limitations. As Immanuel Kant demonstrated in the Critique of Pure Reason, do you need to flip a coin an infinite amount to know the probability of heads is 1 and 2? So there's much more to that. We're going to leave it right there on that story. I want to bring up one other story on the other route. Stanford professors weighing in, should journalists rethink objectivity? So here's what we got here. From the Stanford Daily. Ted Glasser, communications professor at Stanford, said journalists, quote, need to be overt and candid advocates for social justice, and it's hard to do that under the constraints of objectivity. Well, that's a major point right there, Professor. Hard to do that under the constraints of objectivity. Yes. Because there's already a bias right there that you believe that you're coming to think that everybody needs to be under the assumption or under the belief that social justice is what they believe in. But there's a need for social justice. There's an outcry for it. Well, there is a particular part of the public that feels that way, but not everybody. But again, you can't be objective if you're not telling from all different sides. Overt and candid advocates. He's saying we need to be able to create, he says that journalists need to step away from the blanket idea of objectivity to achieve social change. And people don't agree with him. But the question was asked, can journalism contribute to social change while maintaining its objectivity? Well, I can say it's no. Well, yes, it can. Let me rephrase. You do it by not being an advocate. You do it by education. You educate the public so they understand what's going on. And for many decades, that's what people did, was people got educated on civil rights. People got educated on the LGBTQ movement. Okay, people got educated on child abuse or whatever there might be. People got educated. That's what happened. Objectivity became a prominent journalistic principle in the 1920s. According to Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel book, The Elements of Journalism, What News People Should Know and the People Should Expect. Objectivity emerged because the country's faith in science was growing. So Americans felt journalism should also be a scientific process discerning objective truths rooted in facts and evidence. Love it. Now, a political science assistant professor, Hakeem Jefferson, considers objectivity in its current practice to be less focused on determining objective truths and more focused on giving equal weight to different viewpoints, so that the journalist appears fair. Journalists are still hell-bent on being objective from both sides. They can't tell the truth. And he also described journalists as, quote, having to pretend racial inequality isn't normatively bad, or black people in this country don't face a criminal justice system that's grossly unequal, to appear objective in their reporting. Jefferson said, journalists fail in their duty to be truth tellers because of their duty to be objective. We don't need them telling the truth. The truth is in what they write, in the actual stories that they learn about. It's not on the journalists to be advocates. It's dependent on the journalist to get the stories from other people. They're not the ones they're telling the stories of others, not them. Okay, they're not the expert. They're not the spokesperson. They're not the law enforcement, first responder official, the person on the scene, the eyewitness. They're none of those. They are writing the story of firsthand accounts. They were not there for the story itself, although somehow they are. But objectivity is taking what there is, putting the story together so that it makes an understandable story. According to the Neiman Lab, moral clarity arises after a writer assesses the facts in the context of a particular situation, making a moral judgment, and it includes a judgment in his or her article. With that moral clarity, a journalist can make statements that say the criminal justice system is unfair to black people, or that racism is bad, because a journalist holds these claims and are at the root fact-based claims. Despite political polarization, that can lead one to see the statements as biased. Thank you. We've talked about this before. And there's a lot of people that we're talking about in this article. But again, all these articles I'm going to put in the description on the website, broadcasterspodcast.com, or wherever you find the show. They're going to be out there so you can take a look at them for yourselves. There's so much to be said about that. Now, a few other things I want to get to before we finish up the hour of programming tonight. One story I want to take in real quick, and this is from somebody that I know from the cannabis industry space, and I've gotten a chance to schedule and coordinate with and network with on things. And I want to be able to get her on the show. Her name's Cody Sanchez. She is with Entourage Effect Capital. She's one of the partners, with the co-founder, and I think one of the partners of that firm. They do a lot in terms of venture capital in that space. So Cody, she has a weekly newsletter called Contrarian Thinking. You can go to contrarianthinking.substack.com. And it's the idea of challenging the status quo to achieve what we most want in business, sort of investing, wealth building, and doing the things contrarian way. So real quickly, I just like what she put in here. It was great. And she puts in a whole story about how she's able to go ahead and build a blog in 30 days and get 10,000, or build a newsletter and get 10,000 subscribers in 30 days out of a $720 billion media industry. I thought what she put out here was really interesting. So again, she just writes in here, Rupert Murdoch, Michael Bloomberg. By the way, how painful was that presidential one to watch? Jeff Zucker, Bob Iger, and on this is another media behemoths. Their reign and the reign of the news companies they built is coming to an end. She says that media is in a state of massive disruption, with winners and losers rising and falling at warp speed. Anytime there is this much change, I started to get excited. Remember, buy when there is blood on the streets. What's been happening, she says? First, newsrooms have lost or cut half their employees since 2008, according to the Pew Research. Ad revenue, which is their lifeblood, has been declining for decades, now 60%. Google and Facebook command 90% of all online advertising revenue. There you go. New York Times revenue has gone from 60% advertising to 60% subscriptions. Layoffs, sell-offs, shutdowns across Reuters, Vox Media, Vice, Mike, and BuzzFeed. Verizon taking a $5 billion write-down on its media unit, which holds AOL and Yahoo. And 65 million Americans live in countries with only one local newspaper or none. And that's where we are. These are the issues that we have. And again, I will continue to talk about the story of objective journalism, just like I talk about corporate radio. Journalism is the same respect. They need to be called out to the floor on this. But again, as a journalist of my own, which is what I decided to study when I was in college, I'm going to keep doing this until there's change, because I'm going to make change. Hopefully this platform I have will get out to enough people that change will happen. But I am not just sitting here to blow smoke. I want change. I want things to happen as a result of this program. So I will keep doing this program until that's such. If it's possible, I'm going to keep trying. That's what I'm here for the long run. Okay, a couple of stories I want to bring up here before we wrap things up. Another funny story. iHeartRadio had its own survey, so you know it's going to be biased. Speaking of bias, radio continues to be the most trusted media. That's what they say. So some key findings, they say, is that survey of radio listeners found radio to be 79% more or just as trustworthy versus a year ago. Social media is 50% less trustworthy during the same time period. Sentiment for Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter have plummeted in recent months. Facebook down 56%, Instagram down 38%, Twitter down 140%. The survey discovers that radio delivers tangible benefits to listeners, with an overwhelming majority of respondents citing that it improves their mood, helps them feel less isolated, and more connected to their community. Listeners' connection with radio personalities is strong, with 77% trusting the information they receive from their favorite on-air hosts. Interesting. So radio, in that respect, is good, but again, nobody's listening to it. Not enough. Everybody might want to say, 94% of people are listening to radio at least, or put on the radio once a week. No, not so much of that. Again, if that's the case, we need to get more of the audience to engage with radio, because it's a place to trust. But there's not that many people to trust. There's not that much talent out there. And again, radio types have to work harder than their counterparts on television or online. Just how it is. One other story I want to wrap up with here. We talked last week about the Hollywood issue, and Deadline put out a story where we're looking at back to the original story of when I went back to April 2019. Remember, I talked about the Writers Guild of America and the Association of Talent Agents. Well, the ATA is no longer doing the negotiating right now in terms of trying to get packaging fees removed. We'll talk about that in a moment. If you don't remember that, I will refresh your memory. So Writers Guild said it's, quote, has gone about as far as we can go to reach a deal with two of the major talent agencies, WME and CAA. So instead of getting the ATA to get together, more than 100 agencies have signed on to the Writers Guild of America's franchise agreement. In the past 18 months, UTA and ICM Partners are two of the top talent agencies to sign in. It's to end packaging fees on writing services by June 30th, 2022, and limiting agencies to a 20% ownership stake in affiliated production entities. Guild members now have the opportunity to seek to be represented by small, medium, or large top-tier agencies. They're excited to move forward and continue to strengthen our partnerships with the franchise agencies who've committed to unconflicted representation of others. So again, as we talked about the packaging issue, which you might remember I've talked about before, when we go back to April 18, 2019, and what the story was. The labor union representing the Writers Guild of America, and the ones that are finding them jobs and negotiating compensation, the agents who comprise the Association of Talent Agents, they were standing off, and they're still in a standoff, but now we're seeing they're no longer working with two major entities working to work on a franchise agreement. They're not doing it anymore. The idea is it's about money. The fees associated with packaging, the rising trend of agencies working with affiliated producers owned by their parent companies. So the thing is, consolidating all the different talent, screenwriters, directors, producers, affiliated producers that are already under contract by the talent agency, they're put together, and then there's a particular percentage, which never changes. It's a group percentage. So now we're getting it where no matter what, we're going to see more set up so that the writers can now work with, again, what did it say here? How many agencies now? Over 120 agencies now are now signed up to this. And now there's a lot more room for them to go ahead and do what they need to do, which is great. And then by summer 2022, packaging, more or less, should be done. And because of all these different agencies already signing up, the other ones are going to just have to sign up and follow suit. That's what's going on here. Might as well happen. So good on them. But then we still have the problem of getting Hollywood back to work. And that hasn't happened yet. But again, Hollywood is going to be coming back up to production, but with major changes. We still have COVID to deal with. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Robert Pattinson, who's filming Batman over in London, the Batman. They both have contracted COVID. So we're still seeing people that are contracting the virus. They're both significantly healthy adults. Hopefully they'll just recover very well. We hope for the best. But again, this is still being an issue because we have people that are still waiting for therapeutics or vaccinations in order to control what's left of the virus and how people are being affected by it. So people are still being dealt with right now, and that's where we are. So anyway, we're going to leave it there. Thanks for tuning in as you always do. I really appreciate those of you that stayed around to listen to my whole subject about yellow journalism, the yellow journalism bubble as it is. We'll keep on this story and others because most importantly, that's what the show's all about. Come back for another Broadcasters podcast next week because remember, content is king and the control of your content is in your hands.
Thank you for listening to the Broadcasters Podcast, presented by broadcasterspodcast.com and kingofpodcasts.com. The Broadcasters Podcast is brought to you by kingofpodcasts.com/Amazon. If Amazon is good enough for the King of Podcasts, it most certainly is good for you. kingofpodcasts.com/Amazon. And don't forget to check out the King of Podcasts wrestling program. The Wrestling is Real podcast, exclusively at kingofpodcasts.com.